Sarah Chen had heard every dismissive comment in the book during her 12 years as a paramedic. Just an ambulance driver, not a real doctor, couldn't hack medical school. She'd learned to let the words roll off her back like rain on a windshield. But on a sweltering August afternoon at Camp Pendleton, as she walked through the main gates carrying nothing but her worn medical bag and a transfer folder, something extraordinary happened. A young Marine spotted her, and his eyes widened. He snapped to attention so sharply she heard his boots click together. Then another, and another. Within seconds, an entire formation of Marines, battle-hardened men and women who'd seen combat in 3 different countries, stood rigid, rendering the sharpest salute she'd ever witnessed. The base commander himself emerged from his office, and as he approached her with his hand extended, he said 5 words that would change everything. The Angel of Fallujah returns. Sarah Chen had never intended to become a legend. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in San Diego, she'd watched her immigrant parents work brutal hours at their dry cleaning business, never complaining, always pushing forward. Her father had wanted her to become a doctor, to wear the white coat that represented everything their family had sacrificed for. But Sarah had discovered during her volunteer work at the local fire station that she didn't want to wait for patients to come to her. She wanted to run toward the crisis, to be the first hands on scene when seconds meant the difference between life and death. The decision to become a paramedic instead of pursuing medical school had created a rift with her father that took years to heal. He couldn't understand why she'd choose what he saw as a lesser path, why she'd settle for being just anything. Her mother, quieter but no less disappointed, had simply stopped mentioning Sarah's career at family gatherings. Even now, after more than a decade in the field, Sarah sometimes caught herself defending her choice to relatives who still asked when she'd go back to school for something better. The firehouse had been her real education, though. Her partner, Miguel Rodriguez, a gruff 20-year veteran with a salt-and-pepper mustache and laugh lines that crinkled around kind eyes, had taught her that paramedicine wasn't about the prestige. It was about being present in people's worst moments and somehow making them better. He'd shown her how to read a scene in seconds, how to keep your hands steady when your heart was hammering, how to talk someone back from the edge of panic, while simultaneously calculating drug dosages and monitoring 3 different vital signs. She'd learned to ignore the condescension from some ER doctors who treated paramedics like glorified delivery services. She'd developed thick skin against the emergency room nurses who sometimes rolled their eyes at her reports, as if she couldn't possibly understand the complexities they dealt with. She'd smiled politely through countless dinner parties where people, upon learning her profession, would say, "Oh, that's nice," in the same tone they might use for someone who worked at a car wash, respectful enough on the surface, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of, "But what do you really want to do with your life?" What they didn't see were the moments that made it all worthwhile. The grandmother whose heart Sarah had restarted in the back of the ambulance, who now sent her a Christmas card every year with photos of her great-grandchildren. The teenager who'd survived a horrific car crash because Sarah had recognized the signs of internal bleeding that the first responders had missed. The hundreds of small victories that never made the news but that represented someone's mother, father, son, or daughter getting a second chance. Sarah had been working a routine shift on September 15th, 2007, when everything changed. She and Miguel were just finishing their coffee at a truck stop off Interstate 5, debating the merits of the Padres' pitching rotation when Miguel's phone rang. He answered it, and Sarah watched his expression shift from casual to intensely focused in the span of a heartbeat. He listened for nearly 2 minutes without speaking, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When he finally hung up, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something between profound respect and deep concern. "That was Battalion Chief Morrison," he said slowly. "The Marine Corps is requesting civilian medical volunteers for a situation overseas. They need experienced paramedics, specifically those with trauma experience, and who can handle working in hostile conditions. It's completely voluntary, and he made it clear that there are significant risks involved. Sarah's coffee had gone cold in her hands. What kind of situation? She'd asked, though part of her already knew. The war in Iraq had been raging for over 4 years, and while she'd treated several veterans at home who'd returned with both visible and invisible wounds, she'd never considered that her skills might be needed on the actual battlefield. Miguel had slid a folder across the table. They're setting up advanced trauma care facilities closer to the front lines in Fallujah. They have military medics and doctors, but they're stretched impossibly thin. They're looking for people who can handle high-volume trauma without support, who won't freeze when things go sideways, and who can make critical decisions in seconds. Morrison specifically recommended you. The opportunity had terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Sarah had always been driven by the principle that she went where she was needed most, where her skills could make the biggest difference. And while the suburban streets of San Diego certainly needed paramedics, the numbers were undeniable in Fallujah. Casualties were arriving faster than the military medical system could handle them. Young men and women, barely out of high school, were dying from injuries that might be survivable with immediate, expert care. Her father's voice had echoed in her head, just a paramedic. But she'd also heard Miguel's steady voice from her first day on the job. The letters after your name don't matter when someone's dying. What matters is whether you can save them. Sarah had opened the folder and started reading. By the time she'd finished the briefing documents, her decision was made. 3 weeks later, after accelerated training in combat casualty care and survival skills, she'd boarded a military transport plane bound for Iraq, leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into a role that would test every limit she'd ever imagined. The heat in Fallujah was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. It wasn't just hot, it was oppressive, crushing, a physical weight that made every breath feel labored. The air tasted of dust and diesel fuel, and the sun reflected off the sand with an intensity that made her eyes water even behind her protective sunglasses. The forward operating base where she'd been assigned was a chaotic symphony of generators, helicopters, shouted orders, and the distant percussion of artillery that became such a constant soundtrack she almost stopped noticing it. Her first week had been overwhelming. The trauma bay where she worked was a converted warehouse with concrete floors and metal walls that turned it into an oven during the day. The equipment was good, the military spared no expense on medical supplies, but the sheer volume of casualties was staggering. On her third day, they'd received 17 wounded Marines from a roadside bomb attack in a single 30-minute period. Sarah had worked on 3 patients simultaneously, triaging with a speed and precision she didn't know she possessed, her hands moving through procedures while her mind calculated priorities and probabilities. The military doctors and medics had been skeptical of her at first. She was a civilian, a woman, and she didn't have the combat experience that bonded them together. She'd overheard more than one conversation questioning why they needed some paramedic from San Diego when they had Navy corpsmen who'd trained specifically for combat medicine. But Sarah had learned long ago that respect in emergency medicine wasn't given, it was earned, one critical save at a time. Her breakthrough moment had come during her second week. A Marine named Corporal James Whitfield had been brought in with a catastrophic leg injury from an IED blast. He'd already lost massive amounts of blood. His pressure was dropping despite aggressive fluid resuscitation, and he was minutes from going into irreversible shock. The attending surgeon was stuck in another surgery with a patient who couldn't be moved, and the corpsmen were looking to Sarah for guidance with expressions that mixed hope and doubt. Sarah had assessed Whitfield in seconds. The bleeding was from his femoral artery, and if they didn't control it immediately, he wouldn't survive long enough to reach the operating room. She'd performed an emergency femoral artery repair right there in the trauma bay, a procedure that was technically beyond her scope of practice as a paramedic, but that she'd practiced hundreds of times in training and had once performed under a doctor's supervision during a mass casualty incident in San Diego. Her hands had been steady as she'd clamped the artery, sutured the tear, and restored blood flow to his leg. all while directing the corpsman to continue managing his other injuries and maintaining his blood pressure. When the surgeon had finally arrived, ready to take over, he'd examined her work and simply nodded. Textbook repair. He'd said, "You just saved his leg, and probably his life. Nice work, Jen." Whitfield had recovered fully and had personally sought her out before his medical evacuation to thank her, tears streaming down his face as he'd told her about his daughter's upcoming 3rd birthday that he'd been certain he'd never see. Word had spread quickly through the base. The civilian paramedic wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. Soldiers started requesting her specifically when they came in wounded. She had a gift for staying calm when everyone else was losing their composure, for seeing patterns in chaos, for knowing instinctively which patient needed attention first and what intervention would make the difference. But it was the Battle of Fallujah, during the massive November offensive, that transformed Sarah from a respected medical professional into something else entirely. The casualties during those brutal weeks came in waves that defied comprehension. Sarah worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping in 90-minute increments on a cot in the corner of the trauma bay, eating MREs, standing up between patients, her scrubs permanently stained with blood that no amount of washing could remove. On the worst day, November 10th, they'd received 43 casualties in 6 hours. Sarah had personally treated 17 of them, performing emergency procedures ranging from chest decompressions to field amputations, making split-second decisions about who could wait and who needed immediate intervention. She'd lost track of time, moving from patient to patient in a focused trance, her training and instincts operating on a level beyond conscious thought. One patient, a young Marine named Private First Class Marcus Johnson, had arrived with massive abdominal trauma and was crashing fast. The surgeon was elbow deep in another critical patient, and the nearest available doctor was 10 minutes away. Johnson was 19 years old, and through his pain and shock, he'd kept asking Sarah if he was going to die, if she could call his mother, if she could tell his girlfriend he was sorry for not writing more often. Sarah had looked into his terrified eyes, and something had crystallized in that moment, all the self-doubt, all the years of being dismissed as just a paramedic, all the condescension she'd endured suddenly seemed absurdly irrelevant. "Marcus," she'd said firmly, holding his gaze while her hands worked to control his bleeding, "you are not dying today. I've got you, and I'm not letting go. Do you understand me?" She'd performed an emergency laparotomy, opening his abdomen to control internal bleeding, using techniques she'd learned in her combat trauma training, but had never actually performed under fire. It was far beyond what any civilian paramedic would normally do, but this wasn't normal, and Sarah had stopped caring about scope of practice when the alternative was watching a teenager bleed to death. Johnson had survived. So had 16 of the other 17 patients she'd treated that day. The numbers were extraordinary, a survival rate that exceeded what anyone had thought possible, given the severity of the injuries and the limited resources. The Marines had started calling her the Angel, first as a joke, then with increasing seriousness. When Sarah walked through the base, battle-hardened infantry soldiers would nod respectfully, and officers would stop to shake her hand. The nickname had spread beyond her base. Wounded soldiers being evacuated would mention the civilian paramedic who'd saved their lives, and the stories had grown with each telling, until Sarah Chen had become something of a legend, the woman who could cheat death, who could save soldiers that everyone else had written off, who never gave up no matter how desperate the situation appeared. Sarah had returned from Iraq 8 months after she'd arrived, thinner than she'd been in years, with shadows under her eyes that wouldn't fade no matter how much she slept. She'd seen things that would never leave her, the faces of the patients she'd saved and the few she'd lost, the sound of incoming mortars, the smell of the trauma bay, the weight of holding someone's life in her hands while explosions shook the walls around her. She'd come home decorated with commendations from the Marine Corps and the Army, with letters of gratitude from generals and colonels, with photographs of herself surrounded by smiling soldiers who credited her with their survival. But she'd also come home to the same job, the same ambulance, the same streets of San Diego. Miguel had picked her up from the airport and had simply pulled her into a tight hug without saying anything, understanding in the way only another emergency responder could that some experiences couldn't be summarized or explained. The fire department had thrown her a small welcome-back party, and while everyone had been kind and supportive, there was an awkwardness to it. They didn't quite know what to say to her, and she didn't know how to bridge the gap between what she'd experienced and what they could understand. Her father had finally called her, 2 weeks after her return. The conversation had been brief, stilted, full of long pauses. But before hanging up, he'd said something that made Sarah's throat tight. "Your mother and I read the articles about what you did over there. We're very proud of you, Sarah. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that being a paramedic wasn't settling. It was you finding exactly where you belonged." Sarah had thrown herself back into her work, running calls with Miguel, treating cardiac arrests and car accidents and overdoses. The work was meaningful, necessary, important, but after Fallujah, it felt somehow smaller. She'd find herself thinking about the Marines she'd treated, wondering how they were doing, whether the repairs she'd made had held, whether they'd made it home to their families. She'd started volunteering with veteran organizations, using her combat medicine experience to train other first responders in tactical casualty care, trying to channel her Iraq experience into something constructive. The call from Camp Pendleton had come 3 months after her return. The base commander's assistant had been formal and somewhat mysterious, requesting that Sarah come to the base on a specific date for a ceremony honoring civilian contributors to military medicine. Sarah had assumed it would be a small event, maybe a certificate presentation, perhaps a photo opportunity with some mid-level officer. She'd almost declined, uncomfortable with ceremonies and recognition, but Miguel had convinced her to go, arguing that the Marines deserved the chance to thank her properly. She'd driven to Camp Pendleton that August afternoon, wearing civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a simple blue blouse, carrying only her old medical bag that she'd brought to Iraq, which had become something of a talisman. The folder she carried contained her invitation and her identification. As she'd approached the main gate, she'd been lost in thought, mentally reviewing her schedule for the coming week, thinking about a particularly challenging patient she'd transported the day before. The first Marine to snap to attention had startled her so badly she'd nearly dropped her bag. He was young, maybe 22, with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat, but his eyes had widened with recognition, and before she could process what was happening, he'd rendered the sharpest salute she'd ever seen. Then it had cascaded Marines emerging from buildings, stopping mid-conversation, halting their vehicles, all coming to rigid attention, all saluting. Sarah had stood frozen, utterly confused, until she'd heard the distinctive sound of dress shoes on pavement and turned to see Base Commander Colonel Michael Reeves approaching. He was a tall man, in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and a chest full of ribbons that spoke to decades of distinguished service. But what had shocked Sarah was the respect, almost reverence in his expression as he'd extended his hand. "The Angel of Fallujah returns," he'd said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtyard. "We've been waiting for this day, Miss Chen." The ceremony that followed had been beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. She'd been escorted to a parade ground where more than 500 Marines stood in formation. As she'd walked past them, accompanied by Colonel Reeves, they'd all saluted, holding the gesture until she'd passed. The bass band had played, and Sarah had felt tears streaming down her face, though she'd been too overwhelmed to be embarrassed. But the most powerful moment had come when Colonel Reeves had called forward a group of 23 Marines, all of them patients Sarah had treated in Fallujah. Some she recognized immediately. Others had changed so much in the intervening months that she only knew them when they stated their names. Corporal Whitfield was there, walking without a limp on the leg she'd saved. Private Johnson stood tall and healthy, a far cry from the terrified teenager who'd asked if he was dying. They'd formed a line, and one by one, they'd approached her, shaken her hand, and thanked her for their lives. The last Marine in line had been Lieutenant David Park, who'd been so catastrophically injured that Sarah had performed a procedure she'd never even seen done outside of a surgical suite, working with equipment she'd improvised because the proper tools weren't available. He'd been medevaced in critical condition, and Sarah had assumed, based on the severity of his injuries, that he likely hadn't survived the journey. But there he stood, fully recovered, his career intact, preparing for his next deployment. "You told me I wasn't allowed to die," Park had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You said you had me, and you weren't letting go. I remember those words when everything else from that day is a blur. You kept your promise, and because of that, I got to walk my sister down the aisle at her wedding last month. I got to meet my nephew. I get to keep serving with these Marines. I don't have adequate words to thank you for that." Colonel Reeves had then presented Sarah with the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the highest honor the military could bestow on a civilian. As he'd pinned it to her blouse, he'd spoken directly to her, though his words had been amplified across the parade ground. "We have a saying in the Corps: improvise, adapt, and overcome. Miss Chen, you embodied those values in the worst conditions imaginable. You saved lives that trained military surgeons thought were beyond saving. You worked impossible hours under enemy fire, never asking for special treatment, never complaining, never giving anything less than your absolute best. You proved that heroism has nothing to do with your uniform or your rank or your title, and everything to do with your character and your commitment to serving others." He'd paused, looking out at the assembled Marines before continuing. "These men and women stand before you today because you refuse to accept the label of just a paramedic. You refuse to let anyone tell you that your training or your background limited what you could accomplish. You showed us all that excellence recognizes no boundaries, and that the measure of a medical professional isn't in their credentials but in their courage, their competence, and their unwavering dedication to preserving life." The ceremony had concluded with something unprecedented, the entire formation of Marines rendering one final, sustained salute to a civilian paramedic from San Diego who'd proven that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never sought recognition, who simply showed up, did the work, and saved lives, because that's what they'd trained their entire careers to do. As Sarah had walked back to her car afterward, her medal carefully stored in its presentation box, she'd felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a complete absence of doubt about her chosen path. The voices that had questioned her decision, that had suggested she was settling or wasting her potential, had finally been silenced. Not because she'd proven them wrong, exactly, but because she'd proven to herself that she'd been right all along. She'd stopped by the firehouse on her way home, finding Miguel in the bay, polishing the ambulance with the same methodical care he'd shown for 2 decades. He'd looked up as she'd approached, taking in her tear-streaked face and the medal box in her hands, and he'd simply smiled. "So," he'd said, "did they finally figure out what we've known all along?" Sarah had laughed, and it had felt good, cathartic, releasing months of tension and uncertainty. "They called me the Angel of Fallujah," she'd said. "Can you believe that?" Miguel had set down his polishing cloth and had looked at her with the same expression he'd worn on her first day, when he'd told her that paramedicine was about being present in people's worst moments. "Sarah," he'd said, "I've been running calls with you for over a decade. I've watched you talk people back from suicide, restart hearts that had been stopped for minutes, save lives that anyone else would have written off. You didn't become an angel in Fallujah. You already were one. Those Marines just finally had the chance to say thank you." The next morning, Sarah had returned to her regular shift, climbing into the same ambulance, checking the same equipment, running the same streets she'd covered thousands of times before. But something fundamental had shifted. She no longer heard the dismissive comments as criticisms, She heard them as reflections of other people's limited understanding. She no longer felt the need to defend her choice of career, or to justify her decision to be just a paramedic, because she'd learned what the Marines had taught her through their salute and their gratitude, that there's no such thing as just anything when you do it with excellence, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to serving others. She was a paramedic, no qualifiers needed, no apologies required. And on the worst days of people's lives, when seconds mattered and skill meant the difference between tragedy and survival, that was more than enough. It was everything.